Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala ali rasulillah. Welcome in trauma addiction, an extension to a first video about trauma. This is when we're going into psychoanalytic analytics of how we work subconsciously, how our nerves work, how our gut work, and how Quran and maybe jinn shaitans have an impact on us. It's going to be another tough session, so please embrace rahmah, forgiveness to yourself, to others, compassion, especially compassion. Some borrow from the names of Allah subhanahu al-Wadud, al-Latif, the most gentle, the most loving. Tap into Muwada, highest level of love. And don't forget about curiosity. Some of those might be just for you, some of them maybe you're not ready to hear. Nevertheless, it is what it is. Let the journey begin. Assalamu alaikum. Again, warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So, trauma addictions refers to patterns where we unconsciously seek out situations, triggers, clues, invitations, behaviors that replicate or evoke past traumatic experience. And in a weird sense, this is our way to regain a sense of control or familiarity in this world. This is ascertaining the normal as we created it for ourselves in this world. This is us going back to definition. Obviously, it's self-destructive, yet it does happen. And recognizing and addressing this trauma addiction vicious cycle plays a really important role in healing, because it offers us effective interventions and takes us on a journey of long-term recovery if done carefully. So remember from the first video how we've spoken about different trauma and how it plays out in relationships. And this is where we are going deep into trauma addictions. Well, this is not really academic term. However, researchers, the literature inspects and discusses the aspect, the concept, the phenomena of repetitive engagements in seeking out traumatic or highly risk situations. And so far, we're using PTSD, meaning post-traumatic stress disorder, to name it. But there are many people who talk about it actually, and in the first video you already met the Bessel van der Kolk, and the Kolk was is an out of the body keeps a score. Really good book. It's actually a therapist in itself. A very impactful book. And what he suggests is that traumatic experiences can lead to a cycle when individually as unconsciously we create aspects of our trauma over and over again. And he described this as trauma reenactment. And there's another author called Judy Herman, and in her book, Trauma and Recovery, again, she goes back to what we know, PTSD, but from the perspective of repetitive nature of trauma and how we struggle in recovery because we're constantly going back to a cycle of seeking or recreating traumatic situations in our life. Similarly, Bray and Scott, in their book Principles of Trauma Therapy, A Guide to Symptoms, Evaluation and Treatment, they discuss self-harm and other self-harming behaviors as a response to trauma, but at the same time, a way to cope with trauma by creating somatic trauma, okay? Eleanor Walker, in her book, The Battered Woman Syndrome, she talks about domestic violence, but from the perspective of cycle abuse. So she discusses why victims deciding to stay, what keeps them in this relationship. It's obviously a mind game. Tension building, acute birthing, belittling, honeymoon phases, false self-validation. Those are things that, again, forming their normal, but standing from the inner child. Probably traumatic inner child. Definitions of what relationships are. So she calls it cycle of abuse. And Lisa Najavitz, in Seeking Safety, she touches on why people using substance or medication in the response to trauma. And she acknowledges that the root of such a very often addictive behaviors is linked to attempt to self-medicate the pain, which in a sense recreates another somatic trait, trauma pain. So there you go. These are the books for you to read. These are the names you want to familiarize yourself with, or not. But this is something for you to consider. I consider this as a really good talk, and quite an eye-opening from the perspective of trauma addiction. I'm sure you will enjoy it. Bismillah.
Welcome to another where there's many violations of love. So there's lying, there's abuse, there isn't justice. All of those things are happening. They hate that aspect of their childhood. And they never want to see that happen in their life again. They want their needs met, etc. And so they start out with a determination, I'm never going to be abandoned again. I'm never going to be disrespected again. I'm never going to be... Well, welcome back. Childhood. And they never want to see that happen in their life again. They want their needs met, etc. And so they start out with a determination, I'm never going to be abandoned again. I'm never going to be disrespected again. I'm never going to be lied to again. And then they move into adult life and they end up being abandoned again and disrespected again. And it happens over and over. So they create, without realizing it, the very environment that ends up creating what they've been trying to avoid, or the thing that they hate. So let me give you a couple examples just to help you understand it. So somebody that's been abandoned goes, that is the worst emotional experience to go through, being abandoned. Makes you feel like you don't matter at all. I never want that to happen again. So they get in a relationship, determine that they'll never be abandoned, but what they then do is they're super needy, or they test the person all the time, or they try to control the person all the time. And after a while, the other person goes, I'm done with this, and they walk out of the relationship, and the person feels abandoned again. Or I've had so many people say to me, I grew up and I said, I'm never going to be like my dad. My dad was an addict. My dad had anger issues. My dad was in jail periodically. And they're determined not to become their dad. And when they hit adult life, they're an addict, they're in jail, and they got anger issues. Or, I don't want a husband like my last husband. So I'm going to find a new husband who's not going to be like my last husband. And they date and they end up married to somebody that they think is totally opposite of their last husband, and then they find out he's very much like their last husband. Or, I don't want my kids to make the same bad decisions that I made. And so they start out in parenting to try to make sure their kids don't repeat their mistakes. And they find out 15, 20 years later that their kids have made the same decisions that they made when they were a teenager. They created what they were trying to avoid, what they hate. They created the opposite of what they wanted. So why is that? Well, let me give you some reasons, because there's many different factors that can come to play on why we create what we hate. So the first one is a hyper need. So when a need is not met in a child, they can go in two different directions, extremes. They can try to shut that need off, and we'll get back to that in a minute, or it can create a hyper need. I need it, I want it, I want it, I want it. And so let me give you a couple examples. Let's say a child was not validated, and we all have a need to be validated. And so when they come to their teen years and adult life, they have this hyper need of wanting to be validated. So they chase people around. Was I good enough? Was I good enough? They're always looking for applause, for pats on the back. And what happens with that hyper need? People get tired of having that person always looking for validation, and they stop giving them validation. So the child has a hyper need for validation because they never got it as a child, but what they end up is creating is nobody wants to give them validation, exactly what happened when they were a child. Or let's say a person who was never heard. Whenever they tried to explain or give their opinion, nobody listened to them. So now they're going, I need to be listened to. So whenever they're in a conversation, they over-talk, they over-explain, they talk too much, they butt in to get heard, and after a while people go, enough with this person, I'm not even listening to them. So now they're not heard again. They created what they are trying to avoid. Or a person who was never understood. Nobody took the time to understand where they're coming from. So that hurts, and now today they go, I need to be understood. And so now they over-explain everything. Whenever they think somebody doesn't understand them, they chase them around saying, let me explain, let me explain, let me explain. And pretty soon people are tired of that. And so now they end up not being understood again because nobody wants to listen to their never-ending explanations. Or let's say a child was made to feel stupid all the time. So now they think the thing that I need to do in order to not be perceived as stupid is to give very academic answers, to share my opinion all the time. But after a while, people go, I'm tired of listening to this person, and they get treated as if they're stupid again. So that can happen over and over. So that hyper need situation can set a person up to not get that need met. Exactly what happened when they were a child. But then there's another part to this need thing. So sometimes when you shut that need off, you don't even think it's a need, and you just think you have other needs, but you don't understand that that deep, deep need trumps all of the lesser needs in your life. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you were rejected and abandoned. That hurts like crazy. But you just shut that off, and you basically went to, I don't need people. I don't care about people. I'm going to isolate. I'm never going to let people see the real me. I am going to wear masks. I am going to put up walls so that nobody can get close enough to hurt me again. And so you think my need is to be self-sufficient. My need is to be liked by people and to wear masks and to have walls and not be authentic. All of those things, those are my needs, but you don't understand that your deep, deep need is to connect, to be authentic. And so you live in isolation, but now you feel a deep loneliness, a deep longing to be loved. Those two deep needs of connection and love are not being met by your solution to never being rejected or abandoned again. And that desire to be loved will cause you to seek out relationships. It will cause you to miss red flags in relationships and get into relationships with unsafe people, and before you know it, you're getting hurt and abandoned and rejected again. So not understanding the deep, deep needs of the human being, needs that many have turned off because of early wounds, those still will ultimately trump everything else. Another one that I see all the time is a person who grows up with a family where they're constantly shamed, made to feel like they don't matter, like they're stupid, etc. And so they go, I don't need that validation. I don't need all these different needs met. But what they don't realize is they have this deep, deep longing to be validated by their family. Deep, deep longing to be accepted and to belong by their family. And so they go into recovery and they think all my needs is I need to make a few friends, I need to do my recovery work, but they don't understand how deep the longing is for their family to validate them and accept them, and they keep running back to their family for validation, and they keep getting shamed. The very thing they don't want, they ended up creating because they didn't understand that deep need. Now, there's another need kind of variable here that is important to understand. In the case of sexual abuse for a young child, it awakens a drive before kind of the planned time, the natural time when it would be awakened. So the sex drive normally awakens 11, 12 years old. But let's say a child's molested at 5 or 6. What can happen when you have that drive awaken before the planned time is, again, a child can go in two different directions. They just hate sex, turn it off, it's a dirty, bad thing, or they can have a hyper-sex drive, and they can become promiscuous. But what happened to that little child was, I never want to be molested again. I never want to be sexually abused again. I hate it. But then because they end up with this hyper-sex drive and they're promiscuous all the time, guess what happens? They end up in situations where they get sexually abused again. They created what they were trying to avoid without even realizing it.
So that is a really large plate of food to digest.
Now, there's another reason.
Yes, and there's another reason, I'm sure, but let's summarize. This trauma addiction has different expressions. It could be self-sabotaging, reinventing, trauma, denial, anxieties, and projections. So if we're talking about self-sabotaging, it really involves behaviors that intentionally or subconsciously undermine your progress or relationship. So you might sabotage yourself when nearing success or stability in your relationships, because trauma feels more natural. You know that saying, it's too good to be true? You get bored of balance. So you're creating anarchy. Reinventing trauma. And this occurs when we recreate traumatic scenarios in our life. But we do it because we want to evoke similar emotional responses. So this is more about, it's less about behavioral, it's more about affectional reasons. Denial. Denying the impact of trauma or refusing to acknowledge it can be a form of avoiding the pain. Very natural thing to do. And that also can manifest itself in minimalization of the experiences. Oh, I'm fine. You know, it's just a broken leg. It's fine. Anxieties. This is when we interpret situation as traumatic, even if it's not. Almost like we want it to be traumatic. We're dramatizing. And this is a result of hypervigilance, which we already heard about, or overactive threat detection system in our brain. Sometimes we're not living in trauma-laden situation, but because we haven't cope with trauma very well in the past, anything which is stress can feel like trauma. And that's what Bangkok already spoken about in our first lesson about trauma, that not every stress is trauma. That's what he was trying to express. And then there's a really interesting one. This is going into shadow works. We have to explore that in a minute. Projections, very, very, very interesting one, because it involves attributing our own feeling or traits onto other person, almost like it's too difficult to own it, so we dump it on others. So we project the fears of our vulnerable selves into others. And again, seeing threats and malice or hatred in others, when really it is about our own selves. Now, there is a real distinction here which needs to be made between trauma and defense before we go into shadow work. There is a difference between defense or trauma. However, they're very similar. So the expression of trauma or defense might seem similar. The reasons are different. And not every defense is trauma, and not every trauma is defense. Yet every trauma will look like a defense. Okay. So the defense mechanisms are strategies that we are unconsciously using to protect ourselves from anxiety and unacceptable thoughts or feelings. And trauma is the emotional and psychological response to an event, and event that is threatening our safety and security, especially leading to helplessness, vulnerability, and horror. So in defensiveness, we're protecting ourselves from unacceptable and anxiety. And in trauma, we're struggling to process helplessness, vulnerability, and horror. Now, defense is used to reduce or elevate distress or cognitive dissonance. And that also is happening because we need to maintain our self-image and protect our ego from feeling conflicts within ourselves. Now, the reason of how we deal with trauma and through defense mechanisms is because we find it overwhelming, that stress, and too difficult to cope with. And what's on the other end is modern anxiety, it's post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. Now, if we are to give examples of defense and trauma, defense is something that we all have. We are going into fight, flight, and fight mode, something that Bangkok already mentioned. And trauma, not every one of us will experience trauma, like a big trauma. Majority of us will experience small trauma. But it's almost situational reaction. And defense is not of an exceptional. Defense is something you can always count on. It's a survival thing. And trauma is situational thing. However, they are very similarly dealt with. So if we're talking about defense, we're talking about denial, repression, like excluding distressing thoughts or feeling from our consciousness, and refusing to acknowledge painful realities, projection, meaning attributing our own unacceptable thoughts or feelings to others, and rationalization, like we rationalizing things, we offering reasons for unacceptable to happen. With trauma, We see denying and avoidance of pain, or even acknowledging the abuse and its lasting effect. We downplaying the emotional impact. We repress memories. We we focusing, or we working ourselves out, or we redirecting our efforts and attention in order to deal with loss, grief, fear. We ignoring lingering anxieties and flashbacks, and we project as well. So defense and trauma, they look the same, but not every defense is trauma, yet trauma might look like a defense. So nature of defensive mechanisms are really unconscious. It's really unconscious, and it used to cope with our emotional distress, to protect our ego. Well, trauma is an emotional response to deeply distressing health or a life-threatening event. Defense mechanism, they have one purpose: to protect us from internal conflicts or unacceptable thoughts and feelings. However, the purpose of trauma is to respond to external events that overwhelm us. Now, while effective use of defense mechanism can temporarily reduce psychological distress, unresolved trauma can destroy our psychology and spirituality. Treatment addressing a defense mechanism is normally dealt by psychoanalytic, psychodynamic methodologies. And with trauma, we're talking about CBT, EMDR, meaning movement desensitizations, something very new, very popular from where I'm talking. That is 2023. Many counselors, psychotherapists have been trained in that, and CBT has a really good research supporting that. But obviously, there are other methods as well, including Islamic psychology. Now, I promise we're going to talk more about projections, and I'm going to use few voices.
What does it mean to project, and how do you stop doing it? I'm Dr. Tracy Marks, a psychiatrist, and I make mental health education videos. Today's topic is based on a viewer question, and here's the question. I know I project a lot with my spouse. I attribute this to my very low self-esteem, which he made worse by body shaming me with comments such as, "She let herself go," as in, I gained weight. My question is, how do I stop projecting my insecurities when he has made direct comments about my physical appearance? Thank you for this question. First of all, what is projection? Projection is a psychological defense mechanism where you have feelings and emotions that are unacceptable to you, and instead of owning it, you attribute it to someone else. Here's an example. Let's expand on the viewer's question. I'll call her Tina, and I'm making this all up. Tina has always lived in the shadow of her sister, who was prettier, smarter, and more successful. Tina married her college sweetheart right after college and immediately became a stay-at-home wife and then a mom. Tina feels like her life is always about soccer games and homework. So this is the backdrop here. So she and her husband are watching television, and her sister is on the news because she just got promoted to CFO of a tech company. Tina's husband says, "Wow, your sister is amazing." Tina feels hurt by this statement and says, "I bet you regret marrying me. I've never been good enough for you." In fact, Tina is always accusing him of having an affair with a better woman, and each time he's like, "What?" But even though her husband does feel like she has let herself go since she had the kids, he still loves her, but he's sick of her always accusing him of wanting another woman. So what's really behind this? Tina doesn't like herself, and seeing her sister's accomplishments makes her feel even worse about herself. Now, she recognizes this. What she doesn't recognize is, on a conscious level, is that she regrets getting married and having children so young. She loves her kids, but she feels like this stay-at-home life has kept her from blossoming into becoming the best version of herself. And since her youngest child is 9, She feels trapped in a prison sentence of denying her own needs for the next 10 years. Tina projects this unacceptable thought onto her husband, saying that he's the one who regrets getting married. And she justifies this conclusion with his statements about her weight. No, it's not a great thing to say to her, but it's not about her weight. It's about her regrets, and she projects her regrets onto him. Now, these are made up details that I'm using to explain projection. Going back to the viewer's question, I don't know what she's projecting, but the way she asked the question, it sounds like it may be around negative thoughts that she has about herself. More than likely, her weight is just the tip of the iceberg and one of many negative concepts that she has about herself. So the answer to the question of how do I stop projecting when the person is reinforcing some of my insecurities is you have to work through your own negative self-talk. If you have a strong self-concept, someone's insults are hurtful, but you don't own them. They just become external attacks that you fend off. It's only when those insults penetrate your soul and become part of your thinking that you start projecting. Projecting is about what's going on in your head, not about what people say to you. And depending on how much negative self-talk you have, you may need a therapist to help you identify and process away some of these thoughts. Once you reach a higher place of self-acceptance, you won't have the need to project, and other people's comments just become noise that you can choose to give your attention or not. One last point. Psychological defense mechanisms are unconscious, meaning they're things that you do beyond your awareness. Some people will use the term subconscious, but that's really an incorrect term. Using a psychoanalytical model of the mind is split into the conscious thought, which are things that you're aware of, and unconscious thoughts, which are things that you're not aware of. I think people use subconscious because unconscious sounds like you're asleep. That unconscious is an adjective that describes being mentally unresponsive. In this case, unconscious is a noun that describes a part of the mind. Psychoanalytic and psychodynamic psychotherapy seek to make the unconscious behaviors and motivations that you have conscious so that you can change your thoughts and behaviors. The way we do that using a psychodynamic approach is to ask questions about decisions that you made, reactions that you have, that tell a story, that reveal why you do what you do.
And that can be very hard to do. And I suggest it should be done with therapists, with trained therapists. So
Here's
projections
an example, starting with the problem of
projections are very very complex experiences of, I would say, each one of us, because each one of us, we do have a shadow selves. Now, we've gone through quite a selection of trauma addiction expressions: regression, denial, projection, rationalizing, regression. Now, I want you to sit down with yourself and just maybe for next 5 minutes, those defensive mechanisms which are found in fight-flight responses and in trauma as well. They are your reactions. They are patterns of your reactions, not all of them, which might went unnoticed to yourself. You know, they might been actually taking control over you because you didn't know that this is just a human thing to do. So take a moment, go into the tafakkur after this session, and see if you, so to speak, were may be guilty of them. And, think about projections. Have you been attributing on others your undesirable emotions, impulses, or thoughts before? Have you been going into regressions, escaping to easier or former childhood-like patterns of behaviors and feelings? Have you been guilty of repressions, been pushing down unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or thoughts so deep down inside of you so you think that those memories were not existent? How about denial, refusing that accepting or refusing to accept or acknowledging or feeling, painful facts and cause and effects as a coping mechanism? Or are you guilty of rationalizing, meaning inventing thoughts, quite rational, staying in your cognition just in order to minimize impacts of intentions? It's also self-deception, if we think about it, rationalizing. That definitely has a aim to prevent you from anxiety and self-disappointment. So all of those defensive mechanisms, if you look from perspective of psychoanalysis, can take over. And if you look from perspective of Islamic psychology, they deprive you of taking yourself into accountability. And according to three mediators hadith, it's better to take yourself into accountability before somebody else is going to take your accountability. I want to show you what happens when you take yourself into accountability. I want you to feel this journey. I want you to see how it transforms you inside out, how connecting with your shadow selves, with diseases of the heart, with the ugliness, not only with the light inside of you, can free you up, can completely free you up from old patterns. All right. So
my name is Valisa. I'm 32 years old, and this TEDx began as a meditation. I had been reading a lot about herbalism, it's a hobby, and I read about these childhood trauma healing rituals that incorporated floral elements. And so this one particular process called for you to use daisies to adorn your favorite pictures of yourself when you were a child. And so I did that. I took some daisies, I decorated my favorite pictures of myself about 3 or 4 years old. I put those up somewhere where I could see them. And then what was next, you had to meditate with them. You were ultimately building a shrine to your childhood self and meditating and communing with that person. That may not be your cup of tea, but it's my cup of Hennessy. So that's what I did. I went ahead and I meditated with these pictures of my childhood self. And no sooner than I got into a good meditation pose did this question arise on the inside of me. What is missing in these pictures? What is missing in these pictures? These are pictures of myself at 3 or 4 years old, pictures that I had seen over and over again, pictures of myself that elicited the most self-fulfilling sense of love. Pictures I'd seen over and over again that I thought I had memorized every essence, every aspect of nuance of these pictures, and yet the question was arising, what is missing from these pictures? So I was shocked at the question, but I was even more shocked that my spirit had a very intuitively immediate answer that my mind had not been able to rationalize for 32 years. My mother. My mother is what was missing from these pictures. I have no pictures of myself as a baby being held by my mother. I have no pictures of myself as a baby being held by any woman in my family, ever. This is not my mom. This is my Aunt Mary, who is not my biological mother. And this is the only image that I have of a woman holding me. I'm the queen of awkward moments. I just want to let it be awkward in here. It's all right, bro. It's all right. When This is your reality when you've never seen an image of yourself being held by a woman in your family. Living feels like floating. I don't know how, and I don't know why. I reflect a sense of groundedness to people because every day it feels like there's no ground underneath me. Living feels like floating, and not in a light, fun, and airy way, but in a very dark and a very conscious way. I could not for the life of me create a sense of context around who I actually was. So what I did was I developed a subset of subconscious doctrines to help me make sense of what I felt. And here's what I felt. I am unloved. I am unseen. I am unwanted. I am unloved. I am unseen. I am unwanted. I'm unloved, I'm unseen, I'm unwanted. And the only thing that I want to tell you is that it doesn't have to be true for it to be subconscious. It's not the job of your subconscious mind to help you differentiate between what's true and false. The job of your subconscious mind is to exist beneath your conscious mind. I didn't want to share this story with you today. Did not. Seemed sacrilegious to tell. Did not want to share it. Looked for every way, debated and looked for every way that I could get around sharing this story with you because I am very, very committed to not wanting this to be true. So committed to not being grounded in this truth that I couldn't be grounded in the truth because you can't be grounded in the truth and resist the truth at the same time. But I didn't want this to be true, and I didn't want this story to be mine. So I resisted. The thing about this meditation and this shadow work is that I can never go back to who I was before I confronted this shadow. I can never go back to that power dynamic of that shadow. Right? The thing that says you are unloved, you are unhealed, you are unwanted. I can never fully allow that under-informed narrative to be a complete assessment of my identity ever again. And the cycles that I endured while navigating that unhealed narrative, the self-doubt, the fear, the insecurity, I can never see those things as a true reflection of myself ever again because what those things really are is a projection of my shadow. This is called the semantics of shadow work. And I call it that because I love semantics. I love semantics. Semantics is not definition. Definition is what the word means. It's not etymology. Etymology is where the word came from. But semantics is the science of what we mean when we say what we say. And do you know what I recognize is that a lot of people say that they want to be healed, but really what they want is to be untraumatized. A lot of people say that they want to be healed, but really what they want is to be who they were before they were traumatized. Let me alleviate a little bit of pressure for you and ruin your day at the same time. You can never be that. You can never be that. You can never be who you were before you were untraumatized, and that is not in any way, shape, form, or fashion what healing is about. Healing is not about being untraumatized. Healing does not reverse the trauma. It doesn't rewrite the trauma. And let me tell you, it damn sure doesn't ask you to pretend like your trauma does not exist. It does not ask you to go back and change or edit the script of your trauma. Healing is what gives you leverage to move forward without disdain for the truth. So what's the truth? The truth is that your shadow will never not exist. My shadow will never not exist. Our shadows will never not exist. So the objective of our shadow work is not to eliminate the shadow. The objective of the shadow work is to develop a conscientious understanding of where the shadow ends and where the self begins. Where the shadow ends and where the true self begins. People who do not engage in their shadow work, societies that do not fully engage in their shadow work will never be able to create a hard and fast distinction between their shadows and themselves. Because shadow work is that part of the healing process that helps us to confront our most repressed and resisted truths. Our most repressed and resisted truths, not in an effort to make them untrue or even in an effort to make them less true, but in an effort to make ourselves more true, wholly true to ourselves. So how do you know when a person has done their shadow work? How do you know when a person has done their shadow work? That person will not be able to forget, or another word that I use for forget is unknow. That person will never be able to unknow these two things, where they are unhealed and why they are unhealed there. Where they are unhealed and why they are unhealed there. How do you know that a person has not done their shadow work? That person will do everything in their power to forget these two things, where they are unhealed and why They are unhealed there. Why is there power to that? Because when you know where you are unhealed and why you are unhealed, here's the thing, is that people project the trauma and the truth that they do not process. And so when you process where you are unhealed and why you are unhealed there, you have less to project. So societies and people who do not engage in that work, they never develop a hard and fast distinction between their shadows and themselves. The things about trauma that makes it so pervasive is that it doesn't need to be taught in historical context. History has to be taught. Trauma needs only to be acquired. Trauma does not have to be taught. Trauma doesn't need our permission to take up residence in our subconscious mind. Trauma is the history that we cannot unknow. 32 years, nobody ever taught me, nobody ever pointed out to me, Velisa, no pictures exist of you being held by a woman in your family. 32 years, nobody pointed that out. But I could feel the ramifications of my historical context even before I had the words to adequately express it. Nobody taught me that history, but I could feel the trauma. Healing did not make me untraumatized. It will not make me untraumatized. It is not the erasure of the trauma, but healing is the revelation of the truth. And how do we reveal the truth through healing? Through process, because we project whatever trauma and whatever truth we do not process. Now, I done stood up here and took up all your time talking about my trauma. Now I want to talk.
Okay, take a moment. You probably want to come back to this video, maybe more than once. You'll also want to sit down now and journal. Don't forget, journaling is now becoming on a different level, this module, inshallah. And I will see you in that module. Congratulations. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.